Lady Eleanor Beaumont had always known her fate was not her own. Betrothed since childhood to Lord Alistair, the Duke of Ashworth's second son, her life was a meticulously woven tapestry of societal expectations and aristocratic duty. But the Duchess of Ashworth, a woman of formidable will and icy disdain, saw Eleanor as nothing more than a convenient, if unremarkable, vessel for her family's lineage. The public humiliation at the engagement ball, a calculated, cruel spectacle orchestrated by the Duchess herself, shattered Eleanor's world. With her reputation in tatters and her spirit crushed, Eleanor fled Ashworth Hall under the cloak of a moonless midnight, leaving behind the gilded cage and the suffocating expectations. She sought refuge in a remote, forgotten cottage, believing herself forever lost to the world she once knew, unaware that the true Duke, Alistair's elder brother, Lord Julian, had already begun his relentless search for the woman his mother had so cruelly cast aside. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. Lady Eleanor Beaumont possessed a quiet beauty that often went unnoticed amidst the glittering extravagance of the ton. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, held a depth of intelligence and sensitivity that few bothered to discern, often hidden behind a veil of polite reserve. Her hair, a rich chestnut, was usually confined in an elegant, if somewhat severe, coiffure, befitting her station as the intended bride of Lord Alistair, the second son of the formidable Duke of Ashworth. At 19, Eleanor had been raised with the understanding that her life was not her own to command. Her parents, minor gentry with a respectable lineage but dwindling fortunes, had seen the betrothal as a divine intervention, a lifeline thrown to secure their family's future and elevate their standing. For Eleanor, it was a gilded cage, albeit one adorned with the finest silks, the most exquisite jewels, and the promise of a ducal title, albeit a secondary one. The weight of this expectation, the silent gratitude of her family, pressed down upon her shoulders like an invisible mantle, heavy and unyielding, stifling any nascent desires for a different path. Ashworth Hall, the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Ashworth, was a monument to wealth and power, a sprawling edifice of grey stone and gleaming windows that dominated the landscape. Its grounds, manicured to perfection, stretched for miles, encompassing ancient forests, serene lakes, and meticulously designed gardens that bloomed in a riot of colour during the warmer months, a stark contrast to the often chilly atmosphere within the house. The hall itself was a masterpiece of Palladian architecture, its grand salons and ballrooms echoing with centuries of aristocratic whispers, its vast libraries filled with volumes Eleanor longed to devour, but rarely had the leisure or the quiet solitude to do so without interruption. She had resided there for the past year, a guest in all but name, undergoing the rigorous tutelage deemed necessary for a future duchess. She learned the intricate dance of social etiquette, the delicate art of managing a vast household with its myriad servants and complex accounts, and the subtle nuances of aristocratic conversation, where what was left unsaid often held more weight than spoken words. Yet beneath the polished veneer of her education, a part of her yearned for something more, something authentic and unrestrained, a life where her intellect was celebrated rather than merely tolerated, where her opinions were sought, not dismissed. Her days were a predictable rhythm of lessons in French, music and embroidery, punctuated by formal meals and supervised strolls through the gardens. Lord Alistair, her intended, was a pleasant enough young man, handsome in a conventional way, with a penchant for hunting, gambling, and a rather limited interest in anything beyond the superficial pleasures of society. He treated Eleanor with polite indifference, a reflection perhaps of his mother's own sentiments. Their conversations rarely delved beyond the weather, the latest gossip from London, or the merits of a particular horse, and Eleanor often found herself stifling yawns during their obligatory chaperoned outings. There was no spark, No intellectual camaraderie, no shared laughter that reached their eyes. She harbored no grand illusions of passionate love with Alistair. She understood her role, to be a dutiful wife, to bear heirs, and to uphold the Ashworth name with grace and decorum, a silent, elegant fixture in his life. Yet in the quiet solitude of her chambers, as she gazed out at the moonlit gardens, the silver light painting the ancient trees in ethereal hues, she sometimes allowed herself to dream of a different kind of connection, a meeting of minds and hearts, a love that transcended duty and societal convenience, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. These were dangerous thoughts, quickly suppressed, for they threatened the fragile peace she had cultivated within her golden cage, a peace bought at the cost of her own desires and true self. The true architect of Eleanor's predetermined path, and indeed of much of Ashworth Hall's rigid, almost suffocating atmosphere, was the Duchess of Ashworth herself, Lady Beatrice. A woman of imposing stature and an even more imposing will, Lady Beatrice was the epitome of aristocratic hauteur. Her silver hair, always impeccably styled, framed a face that rarely softened, her piercing blue eyes missing nothing, scrutinizing everything. She moved through the grand halls with an air of unassailable authority, her silk gowns rustling like a warning, her every gesture a command, her voice a low, resonant tone that brooked no argument. To Eleanor, the Duchess was a constant, chilling presence, a silent judge whose approval was perpetually withheld. A formidable gatekeeper to a future Eleanor was not sure she truly wanted. Lady Beatrice had consented to the match with Eleanor not out of affection or even respect for the young woman, but out of a cold, calculated assessment of Eleanor's unblemished reputation, suitable lineage, and, crucially, her perceived docility and lack of strong connections that might challenge the Duchess's own influence. She saw Eleanor as malleable, easily controlled, a necessary component in her grand design for the Ashworth dynasty. A quiet girl who would not challenge her authority or overshadow her favoured son, Alistair, whom she considered too easily swayed. The Duchess's disdain for Eleanor was subtle but pervasive, a constant drip of cold water on Eleanor's spirit, slowly eroding her confidence. A raised eyebrow when Eleanor expressed an opinion on a book she had read, a dismissive wave of the hand when she offered a suggestion for the household accounts, a thinly veiled critique disguised as advice. One must always remember one's place, Lady Eleanor, particularly when one is not yet fully established in such a prominent family. Modesty is a virtue often overlooked in these modern times. These were the weapons she wielded, sharp and precise, designed to keep Eleanor firmly in her perceived inferior position, to remind her that she was an outsider, a charity case, despite her noble blood. Eleanor, ever sensitive and eager to please, felt the weight of it daily. She tried to conform, to prove herself worthy, to anticipate the Duchess's unspoken desires, to become the perfect silent bride, but it was a futile endeavour. The Duchess had already judged her, found her wanting in some indefinable, aristocratic quality that Eleanor could never hope to acquire, and nothing Eleanor did could alter that verdict. She was a pawn, a means to an end, and the Duchess made sure she never forgot it, subtly undermining her confidence at every turn, ensuring she remained meek and compliant. Eleanor often sought solace in the vast library, a sanctuary from the Duchess's watchful eye and the stifling atmosphere of the drawing rooms. There, surrounded by leather-bound volumes, the scent of old paper and ink a comforting balm, she could lose herself in tales of adventure, philosophy and poetry, imagining lives far removed from the rigid confines of Ashworth Hall. She found a particular affinity for stories of independent women, those who defied convention and forged their own paths, though she knew such a life was utterly unattainable for her. The contrast between the vibrant worlds within the books and her own constrained reality was a constant ache in her heart. She was a bird in a gilded cage, fed and cared for, adorned with beautiful feathers, but with clipped wings, unable to soar. The thought of spending the rest of her days under the Duchess's cold scrutiny, married to a man who saw her as little more than a decorative possession, filled her with a quiet despair. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Eleanor sat in the drawing room, dutifully embroidering a sampler of intricate floral patterns under the watchful, critical eye of Lady Beatrice, a letter arrived. The footman presented it on a silver tray, and the Duchess opened it with a flourish, her expression unreadable, though a flicker of satisfaction, almost triumph, crossed her features. "It is from Lord Alistair," she announced, her voice cutting through the quiet, carrying an air of finality that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "He has secured the final permissions from the family solicitors. The engagement ball is set for 3 weeks hence, to coincide with the Duke's annual autumn gathering." "A most auspicious occasion indeed," Eleanor's needle faltered, pricking her finger, a tiny bead of crimson welling on her skin. 3 weeks. The day she was to officially step into her predetermined future, to be presented to society as the future Lady Alistair, her fate irrevocably sealed, her last vestiges of freedom extinguished. A tremor of unease, cold and insistent, snaked through her, tightening its grip around her heart, a premonition of impending doom. She glanced at the Duchess, who merely offered a tight, humourless smile, her eyes gleaming with a chilling satisfaction. "You will need a new gown, Eleanor, something suitable for the occasion. We cannot have you looking inadequate, particularly with so many important guests in attendance, including the Duke himself and his elder son, Lord Julian, who will be returning from his travels abroad." The word hung in the air, a subtle barb, reminding Eleanor of her place, of her perceived deficiencies, of the Duchess's constant judgment. The golden cage was about to be locked, its bars reinforced, and the key thrown away. The grand event loomed, a glittering precipice from which there would be no turning back, a public declaration of her surrender to a life she did not choose, a life dictated by others. The unease grew into a cold dread, a premonition of something terrible yet to come, a feeling that the very foundations of her carefully constructed world were about to crumble. The night of the engagement ball arrived, cloaked in a deceptive shimmer of elegance and anticipation, a cruel masquerade for the tragedy that was to unfold. Ashworth Hall, usually a bastion of quiet formality, was transformed into a dazzling spectacle. Hundreds of candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, casting a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors and the vibrant tapestries adorning the walls, depicting scenes of ancient hunts and noble feasts. The air hummed with the murmur of polite conversation, the rustle of silk gowns, and the faint intoxicating scent of exotic flowers mingling with the heavier aroma of roasted meats and fine wines. Eleanor, dressed in a gown of pale rose silk, its delicate lace trim a stark contrast to the heavy dread in her heart, felt like an actress on a stage, playing a role she had not chosen, a sacrificial lamb adorned for the slaughter. Her maid, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, had done her best to infuse some cheer into Eleanor's demeanour, praising her beauty and assuring her of a wonderful future. But even the most artful coiffure could not entirely mask the apprehension in Eleanor's eyes, which darted nervously around the opulent ballroom. Lord Alistair, looking dashing in his formal attire of deep blue velvet, offered Eleanor a perfunctory smile as they descended the grand staircase, his hand barely touching her arm. He seemed utterly oblivious to her inner turmoil, his attention more focused on greeting the endless stream of guests, particularly the younger ladies who fluttered their eyelashes in his direction. The Duchess of Ashworth, Lady Beatrice, stood at the foot of the stairs, a regal figure in deep sapphire velvet, her diamonds glittering under the candlelight, her expression a mask of impeccable hospitality. Her eyes, however, held a glint that Eleanor could not quite decipher, a cold, calculating spark that sent a shiver down her spine, a premonition of impending doom. The Duke, Lord Alistair's father, A kindly but somewhat ineffectual man offered Eleanor a reassuring pat on the hand, sensing her nervousness, and whispered, "Chin up, my dear. It will all be over soon." But his gaze quickly drifted to his wife, whose formidable presence seemed to eclipse all others, even his own. The evening progressed in a blur of introductions, polite dances, and forced smiles. Eleanor moved through the throng, a ghost at her own celebration, acutely aware of the whispers that followed her, the speculative glances, the subtle shifts in conversation as she approached. She knew her background, though respectable, was not quite on par with the Ashworths, and she felt the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken judgment of a society obsessed with lineage and fortune. The Duchess, meanwhile, circulated with effortless grace, her laughter ringing a little too loudly, her compliments a little too effusive, her movements precise and deliberate. She seemed to be orchestrating the entire event, a puppet master pulling invisible strings, her eyes constantly scanning the room, always returning to Eleanor. Eleanor noticed her mother-in-law to be engaging in prolonged, hushed conversations with several influential dowagers, their heads bent together in conspiratorial whispers, their gazes occasionally flicking towards Eleanor with an unsettling intensity, like vultures circling their prey. A knot of unease tightened in Eleanor's stomach, growing colder and heavier with each passing moment. As the clock neared midnight, the moment arrived for the official announcement of the engagement. The orchestra quieted, the lively strains of a waltz fading into silence, and a hush fell over the ballroom, thick with anticipation. Lord Alistair, with Eleanor on his arm, led her to the centre of the room, where the Duke and Duchess stood. Bathed in the glow of the chandeliers, the Duke, clearing his throat, began to speak, his voice booming slightly in the sudden silence. He spoke of the union of two esteemed families, of the promise of a bright future, of the happiness he anticipated for his son and his future daughter-in-law. Eleanor felt a faint blush creep up her neck, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a strange, fleeting hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this might not be as terrible as she feared, that she might yet find a measure of contentment in this arranged life. Then the Duchess stepped forward, her sapphire gown shimmering under the candlelight, her smile, usually so tight, widening into something almost predatory, a wolf's grin. "Indeed," she began, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the room, each word a carefully aimed dart, a most auspicious occasion. However, there has been a slight misunderstanding. A ripple of confusion spread through the guests, a collective intake of breath. Eleanor's breath hitched, caught in her throat. Her gaze flew to Alistair, who looked equally bewildered, a frown creasing his brow. The Duke frowned too, a puzzled expression on his face, clearly unprepared for his wife's deviation from the script. The Duchess continued, her voice gaining a chilling edge, laced with a false sorrow that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "It has come to my attention, and indeed to the attention of the entire Ashworth family, that Lady Eleanor Beaumont is not, in fact, the suitable match we once believed her to be." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a stunned silence. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, her hands trembling uncontrollably, her knees threatening to buckle. Her family's financial standing, while once adequate, has regrettably suffered a significant downturn in recent months, a fact only recently brought to our attention, and one that would make her dowry insufficient for a son of Ashworth. The lie was delivered with such conviction, such practiced ease, that many guests nodded in understanding, their initial shock giving way to a more pragmatic assessment. Furthermore, the Duchess paused, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor with an expression of profound distaste, as if Eleanor were something unpleasant she had just discovered. There have been whispers of a certain indiscretion, a clandestine meeting with a gentleman of questionable repute, observed by a reliable source just last week, in a secluded part of the estate grounds. The accusation hung in the air, a venomous cloud, poisoning the very atmosphere of the ballroom. Eleanor gasped, her mind reeling, struggling to comprehend the enormity of the fabrication. Indiscretion, clandestine meeting. It was a blatant lie, a cruel, calculated fabrication. She had spent the entire previous week confined to Ashworth Hall under the Duchess's own watchful eye, rarely leaving the house, let alone meeting a mysterious gentleman. "That's not true," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a desperate plea. But the Duchess merely raised a dismissive hand, her expression hardening. "Silence, girl," Lady Beatrice commanded, her voice like ice, cutting through Eleanor's feeble protest. "Do you dare to contradict me in my own home before these esteemed guests? The evidence, I assure you, is quite compelling. Such behaviour, I need not remind you, is entirely unbecoming of a future Lady Alistair. It would bring shame upon our ancient and honourable name, a stain we cannot afford." Lord Alistair, pale and visibly uncomfortable, shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on the floor. He glanced at Eleanor, then quickly away, unwilling to meet her gaze, his silence a damning indictment, a tacit agreement with his mother's cruelty. The Duke looked distressed, his face etched with concern, but remained silent, clearly intimidated by his wife's ferocity, unable or unwilling to challenge her. The guests, initially shocked, now began to murmur, their whispers growing louder, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity, scandalized curiosity, and thinly veiled triumph from those who had always resented Eleanor's elevation. Eleanor felt their stares like physical blows, each one a fresh wound, each whisper a shard of glass piercing her heart. Her carefully constructed world, her fragile peace, shattered into a million pieces around her. The golden cage had not merely been opened, it had been violently torn apart, exposing her to the harsh, unforgiving light of public scorn, her reputation irrevocably ruined. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, blurring the faces of the guests, turning the glittering ballroom into a distorted, nightmarish tableau of mocking faces and condemning shadows. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic bird desperate to escape its broken cage. The humiliation was absolute, searing, a brand upon her soul that she felt would never fade. She could feel the heat of it on her cheeks, the shame burning through her veins, consuming her. She was not merely rejected, she was publicly disgraced, accused of a transgression she had not committed. Her character assassinated by the very woman who had promised her a future, all for some unknown cruel purpose. "Therefore," the Duchess concluded, her voice ringing with false regret, a performance worthy of the Covent Garden stage, "it is with the deepest reluctance that I must announce the dissolution of the betrothal between Lord Alistair and Lady Eleanor Beaumont. It is a regrettable turn of events, but one necessitated by circumstances beyond our control, and indeed beyond Lady Eleanor's own suitability for such a distinguished position." The words echoed in Eleanor's ears, a death knell to her hopes, to her very identity, to any semblance of a future she might have imagined. She stood frozen, a statue of despair, as the murmurs swelled into a cacophony of whispers and gasps, the sound of her world collapsing. Alistair, emboldened by his mother's declaration, took a decisive step back from her, effectively severing their connection, a silent endorsement of the Duchess's cruel pronouncement, a final act of betrayal. Eleanor felt utterly alone, exposed and utterly broken. The grand hall, once a symbol of her future, now felt like a vast, echoing chamber of her undoing, a prison of her shame. All she could think of was escape, a desperate primal urge to flee this place, these people, this unbearable shame. She had to disappear, to vanish from the face of society, to find a place where the Duchess's venomous words could never reach her again, where she could simply cease to exist in the eyes of the ton. The need was overwhelming, a desperate, suffocating plea from her shattered spirit, a silent scream for oblivion. The midnight escape from Ashworth Hall was a blur of terror and adrenaline. Eleanor, her rose silk gown still clinging to her, had slipped out a servant's entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She carried nothing but a small reticule containing a few coins and a miniature portrait of her late mother. The moonless night was her only accomplice, its darkness a welcome shroud for her shame. She walked for hours, the chill autumn air biting at her exposed skin, until she reached the nearest coaching inn, a humble establishment far removed from the grandeur of the ducal estate. There, she paid for a seat on the first coach heading west, away from London, away from society, away from the Duchess's cruel reach. Her destination was a small, secluded village in Dorset, where her mother's elder sister, Lady Augusta Thorne, resided. Lady Augusta, a widow of independent means and spirit, had always been a beacon of unconventional wisdom in Eleanor's life, a stark contrast to the rigid formality of her parents and the Ashworths. The journey was long and arduous, a physical manifestation of her emotional turmoil. Each jolt of the coach, each passing mile, felt like a severing of ties, a painful but necessary detachment from her former life. When she finally arrived at Lady Augusta's modest cottage, nestled amidst rolling green hills and ancient oak trees, she was a shadow of her former self, exhausted, dishevelled, and utterly broken. Lady Augusta, a woman with kind, shrewd eyes and a gentle smile, took one look at Eleanor's tear-streaked face and the haunted expression in her eyes, and without a single question enveloped her in a warm embrace. "My dear girl," she murmured, stroking Eleanor's hair, "you are safe now. You are home." In the quiet sanctuary of Lady Augusta's cottage, Eleanor slowly began to heal. The days were filled with simple pleasures, long walks through the countryside, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, the comforting rhythm of domestic chores, and hours spent in Lady Augusta's small but well-stocked library. Lady Augusta, sensing Eleanor's fragile state, did not press her for details of her ordeal. Instead, she offered solace through quiet companionship, nourishing meals, and gentle encouragement. She listened patiently when Eleanor finally found the courage to recount the devastating events of the ball, her eyes filled with understanding, not judgment. "That woman," Lady Augusta declared, a rare flash of anger in her eyes, "is a viper. But her venom cannot touch your true worth, Eleanor. Remember that." Lady Augusta became Eleanor's mentor, not through formal lessons, but through example and insightful conversation. She encouraged Eleanor to read widely, to discuss philosophy, politics, and art, subjects that had been deemed unsuitable for a young lady of society. She introduced Eleanor to a small, eclectic circle of friends, a retired scholar who dabbled in botany, a spirited artist who painted landscapes, and a progressive vicar who believed in education for all. In their company, Eleanor found herself blossoming. Her intelligence, long suppressed and undervalued, was not only tolerated, but celebrated. She discovered a passion for natural history, spending hours sketching local flora and fauna, her keen eye for detail finding beauty in the smallest things. She learned to speak her mind, to engage in lively debates, to laugh freely without fear of censure. The quiet, reserved girl from Ashworth Hall slowly began to shed her skin, revealing a vibrant, thoughtful woman beneath. One blustery afternoon, as Eleanor and Lady Augusta were returning from a walk, they encountered a lone rider on the winding country lane. He was a tall, imposing figure, dressed in practical riding clothes rather than the elaborate finery of the ton. His dark hair was windswept, and his eyes, a startling shade of grey, held an intensity that immediately captivated Eleanor. He dismounted with an easy grace, his gaze falling upon Eleanor with an unexpected warmth. "Lady Augusta," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "a pleasure as always. And you must be Lady Eleanor. I am Julian, Duke of Ashworth." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The Duke. Not Alistair, but his elder brother, the true Duke, Lord Julian. She had heard whispers of him, a man who preferred the solitude of his country estates to the glittering social whirl of London, a scholar and a recluse, rarely seen by society. He was the one who had inherited the ducal title upon his father's recent passing, a fact Eleanor had only vaguely registered in her haze of despair. He was also the one whose mother had so cruelly destroyed her. A flush of shame crept up her neck, and she instinctively recoiled, remembering the Duchess's venomous words. Lady Augusta, however, greeted him with genuine affection. "Julian, my dear boy, what a pleasant surprise. Yes, this is my niece Eleanor. She has been staying with me." She gave Eleanor a subtle, encouraging squeeze of the arm. Julian's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding in his grey eyes. "Lady Eleanor, I am truly sorry for the circumstances that have brought you to Dorset. My mother's actions, they were entirely reprehensible." His words were direct, honest, and utterly disarming. He did not offer platitudes or evasions. He acknowledged the wrong, and for the first time since the ball, Eleanor felt a tiny crack in the wall of her despair. Over the following weeks, Julian became a frequent visitor to Lady Augusta's cottage. He was unlike any gentleman Eleanor had ever met. He was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a quiet strength that was both comforting and intriguing. He spoke of his travels, his studies, his plans for improving his estates, and he listened intently when Eleanor spoke of her own burgeoning interests in botany and local history. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a disgraced debutante, not as a pawn in a societal game, but as an intelligent, sensitive woman. He never mentioned Alistair, nor did he dwell on the past, but his presence was a constant, unspoken apology for his family's cruelty. Eleanor found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that surprised her. Their conversations were stimulating, their shared laughter genuine. He challenged her intellect, encouraged her curiosity, and treated her with a respect that was a balm to her wounded spirit. She learned that Julian had been abroad during the engagement ball, returning only to find the scandal already in full swing. He had been appalled by his mother's actions and had immediately sought out Lady Augusta, knowing she would offer Eleanor refuge. He had been searching for Eleanor, quietly, discreetly, ever since. One evening, as they sat by the fire, discussing a newly published scientific treatise, Julian looked at Eleanor, his grey eyes warm and earnest. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low, "I know what my mother did was unforgivable, but I hope you will not allow her cruelty to define your future. You are a woman of remarkable spirit and intellect. You deserve a life of purpose, of joy." He paused, then added almost hesitantly, "and perhaps a life where you are truly valued, truly loved." Eleanor's heart fluttered. His words resonated deep within her, stirring a tentative spark of hope, a sense of untapped potential she had almost forgotten she possessed. She had fled Ashworth Hall believing her life was over, her future irrevocably ruined. But here, in this remote cottage, surrounded by kindness and intellectual stimulation, and in the presence of a man who saw her worth, she began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, a new, unexpected path was opening before her. The golden cage was far behind her, and the whispers of change were growing louder, promising a future she dared to dream of. Months passed in the tranquil Dorset countryside, and Eleanor's transformation was profound. Under Lady Augusta's gentle guidance and Julian's unwavering respect, the timid, heartbroken girl had blossomed into a confident, self-assured woman. Her eyes, once clouded with apprehension, now sparkled with intelligence and a newfound zest for life. She had immersed herself in her studies, her botanical sketches, and her lively discussions with Lady Augusta's intellectual circle. The remote cottage, once a refuge from shame, had become a crucible of self-discovery. Julian's visits had become a cherished routine. Their bond deepened with each shared conversation, each quiet moment of understanding. He had revealed himself to be a man of integrity and profound kindness, burdened by his mother's machinations, but determined to forge his own path. He never pressured Eleanor, never spoke of marriage, but his devotion was evident in every thoughtful gesture, every lingering glance. Eleanor, in turn, found herself falling irrevocably in love with the true Duke of Ashworth, a love born not of duty or convenience, but of shared values and genuine affection. One crisp spring morning, Lady Augusta presented Eleanor with an invitation, the annual Ashworth Charity Gala. she announced, her eyes twinkling. "A grand affair, held at the London estate. They are raising funds for the local orphanage this year. I believe it is time, my dear, for you to re-enter society, not as the disgraced Lady Eleanor, but as the woman you have become." Eleanor's heart pounded. The thought of facing the Ton, and more specifically the Duchess, filled her with a familiar dread. But then she looked at Julian, who had arrived just as Lady Augusta spoke. He met her gaze, a silent promise of support in his grey eyes. "You are not alone, Eleanor," he said softly, "and you have nothing to be ashamed of." His words were a shield, a fortification against her fears. She took a deep breath. "Very well," she declared, her voice firm. "I will go, but on my own terms." The journey to London was different this time. Eleanor felt a quiet strength within her, a sense of purpose that had been absent before. Lady Augusta had commissioned a new gown for her, a stunning creation of deep emerald silk that complemented Eleanor's eyes and chestnut hair, designed to convey elegance and quiet power, not ostentation. The night of the gala arrived, and Eleanor, accompanied by Lady Augusta and Julian, stepped into the glittering ballroom of Ashworth House in London. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the hum of hundreds of voices. For a moment, the old fear threatened to overwhelm her, but then she saw Julian's reassuring smile, and she straightened her shoulders. She was no longer the timid girl who had fled in shame. She was Eleanor Beaumont, a woman of intellect and spirit, and she would not be cowed. Her entrance caused an immediate stir. Whispers rippled through the crowd as familiar faces turned, their expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity, and in some cases, outright shock. Many had believed her to be utterly ruined, banished from society. But here she was, radiant and composed, on the arm of the Duke of Ashworth himself. It wasn't long before the inevitable confrontation occurred. The Duchess of Ashworth, Lady Beatrice, swept towards them, her face a mask of barely concealed fury. She was accompanied by Lord Alistair, who looked distinctly uncomfortable, and several of her most loyal, gossiping cronies. "Eleanor," the Duchess purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What a surprise! I had not expected to see you here. I understood you had found a more rustic existence." Her eyes raked over Eleanor's gown, searching for a flaw but finding none. Eleanor met her gaze, her own steady and unwavering. "Duchess," she replied, her voice calm and clear, "I find that a rustic existence can be quite invigorating. It allows one to cultivate a truer sense of self, away from the superficialities of society." The Duchess's smile tightened. "Indeed, and I see you have found a new patron." Her gaze flicked to Julian, a venomous glint in her eyes. "Julian, my dear boy, I am surprised to see you associating with such company. Have you forgotten the scandal this young woman brought upon our family name?" Julian stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Eleanor's arm. His voice, usually so calm, held an edge of steel. "Mother, I believe you are mistaken. Lady Eleanor brought no shame upon our family. It was your actions, your cruel and baseless accusations, that caused the scandal. I have spent the past months rectifying the damage you inflicted." A collective gasp swept through the nearby guests. The Duchess's face flushed crimson. "How dare you, Julian? Are you questioning my judgment, my honor?" "I am questioning your integrity, Mother," Julian stated, his voice resonating with authority. "And your compassion. Lady Eleanor is a woman of impeccable character, intelligence, and grace. She was wronged, grievously so, and I, as the Duke of Ashworth, will not stand by and allow such injustice to persist." He turned to the assembled guests, his gaze sweeping over them. "Let it be known, ladies and gentlemen, that the accusations levelled against Lady Eleanor Beaumont were entirely false, fabricated by my mother for reasons I cannot fathom, but which I deeply regret. Lady Eleanor is innocent of any wrongdoing, and her honour is beyond reproach." The ballroom erupted in a flurry of whispers. Lord Alistair, mortified, tried to melt into the crowd. The Duchess, utterly blindsided by Julian's public repudiation, stood frozen, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. Eleanor felt a surge of triumph, a profound sense of vindication. Julian had not merely defended her, he had publicly cleared her name, dismantling the Duchess's lies with unwavering conviction. Julian then turned back to Eleanor, his grey eyes filled with a love and respect that took her breath away. He took her hand, his touch warm and firm. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, yet still carrying enough to be heard by those closest, "you have shown remarkable strength and resilience. You have taught me the true meaning of courage and authenticity. I have come to realize that a life without you, a life without your intellect, your spirit, your kindness, would be an empty one. I know my family has caused you immense pain, but I hope you will allow me to atone for it. Lady Eleanor Beaumont, will you do me the honor of becoming my Duchess? Will you marry me, and together let us build a future founded on truth, respect, and genuine affection?" The proposal, delivered with such sincerity and public defiance, sent another wave of shock and excitement through the ballroom. Eleanor's heart soared. This was not a duty, not an obligation, but a choice, a profound declaration of love and partnership. Her eyes, brimming with tears of joy, met Julian's. "Yes, Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I will." The applause that followed was deafening, a resounding affirmation of her new, chosen path, a complete and utter triumph over the Duchess's cruel machinations. The future, once a terrifying unknown, now stretched before her, bright with promise and the unwavering love of a man who truly saw her. The aftermath of Julian's public proposal was nothing short of a societal earthquake. The Ton, ever hungry for scandal and drama, found themselves with a story far more compelling than the Duchess of Ashworth's fabricated whispers. The Duke of Ashworth, the most eligible bachelor in England, had not only publicly vindicated Lady Eleanor Beaumont, but had also declared his love and offered her his hand in marriage, effectively elevating her to the highest rank in the peerage. The contrast with her previous humiliation was stark and undeniable. Where once there had been whispers of disgrace, there were now murmurs of admiration for Eleanor's resilience and Julian's unwavering devotion. The Duchess of Ashworth, Lady Beatrice, found herself in an unprecedented position. Her carefully constructed social standing, built on decades of manipulation and intimidation, had been publicly dismantled by her own son. The very people who had once hung on her every word now regarded her with a mixture of pity and thinly veiled scorn. Her cronies, sensing the shift in power, quickly distanced themselves, leaving her isolated and fuming. Lord Alistair, relieved to be out of the uncomfortable spotlight, quietly retreated to his country estate, his reputation largely unscathed, but his mother's in tatters. Eleanor, however, was not content to simply bask in her vindication. She knew she needed closure, not just for herself, but to truly step into her new life, unburdened by the past. A few days after the gala, Julian arranged a private meeting between Eleanor and his mother at Ashworth House. The Duchess, still reeling from the public humiliation, received them in a drawing room that felt colder and more austere than usual. Her face was pale, her lips a thin, angry line. "Mother," Julian began, his voice firm but calm, "Eleanor wished to speak with you." Eleanor stepped forward, her heart beating a steady rhythm of courage. She looked at the woman who had tried to destroy her and saw not the formidable tyrant she once feared, but a bitter, defeated woman. "Duchess," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady, "I came here not to gloat, but to understand. Why did you do it? Why did you seek to ruin me with such cruel lies?" Lady Beatrice scoffed, her eyes flashing with a flicker of her old fire. "You were not suitable, girl. You were a nobody, a mere convenience for Alistair. You would have brought nothing but mediocrity to the Ashworth name. And yet," Eleanor countered, her gaze unwavering, "your actions have brought more shame upon the Ashworth name than any perceived mediocrity of mine ever could. You sought to control, to manipulate, to destroy, all to uphold an image of perfection that was, in truth, a facade. Julian sees beyond such superficialities. He sees worth in character, in intellect, in kindness, qualities you seem to have forgotten. The Duchess flinched, her eyes widening slightly at Eleanor's unexpected strength. "You presume too much, girl," she spat, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "No, Duchess," Eleanor replied, a quiet dignity in her bearing. "I presume nothing. I merely state the truth. I forgive you for your cruelty, not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry the burden of your bitterness any longer. My future is not defined by your past actions, but by my own choices and by the love and respect I share with Julian." She paused, then added, her voice softening slightly, "I hope one day you might find some peace and perhaps a measure of happiness that does not come at the expense of others." With that, Eleanor turned and walked out, Julian following close behind, a proud smile on his face. The confrontation was over. There was no grand apology from the Duchess, no sudden change of heart, but Eleanor felt a profound sense of release. She had faced her tormentor, spoken her truth, and emerged stronger. The past was finally laid to rest. Preparations for the wedding began immediately, a whirlwind of activity that was a joyous contrast to the somber arrangements of her previous betrothal. Julian insisted that Eleanor have complete freedom in choosing every detail, from the wedding gown to the guest list, a stark symbol of her newfound autonomy. They decided on a quiet ceremony at Lady Augusta's local church in Dorset, followed by a celebratory gathering at a smaller, more intimate estate Julian owned nearby, rather than the grand, impersonal affair at Ashworth Hall. This choice underscored their desire for a life built on genuine connection, away from the stifling expectations of the ton. Eleanor chose a gown of simple, elegant ivory lace, eschewing the elaborate silks and jewels that had once felt like a costume. She personally selected the flowers for the bouquets, choosing wildflowers from the Dorset meadows she had come to love. Every decision was a conscious act of embracing her true self, a celebration of her journey from a gilded cage to a chosen path. Julian, ever attentive, supported her every choice, his happiness mirroring her own. The day before the wedding, Eleanor stood in Lady Augusta's cottage, packing the last of her belongings. She picked up the miniature portrait of her mother, the one she had clutched during her midnight escape. She looked around the small, comforting room that had been her sanctuary, her haven of healing. A wave of emotion washed over her, gratitude for Lady Augusta's unwavering support, a pang of nostalgia for the quiet days of self-discovery, and a thrill of anticipation for the future. This departure was not a flight from shame, but a joyful step towards a new beginning, a true home with the man she loved. As she closed her trunk, a sense of profound peace settled over her. She was no longer the girl scorned by the Duke's mother, but the woman chosen by the Duke himself, not for her lineage or her dowry, but for her spirit, her intelligence, and her heart. She walked out of the cottage, Lady Augusta smiling warmly at her side, towards a future she had dared to dream of, embracing the unknown with courage, knowing that with Julian she would never be truly alone again. Months turned into a year, and then two, since Eleanor became the Duchess of Ashworth. Her life, far from the stifling grandeur of Ashworth Hall, flourished in the vibrant community surrounding Julian's smaller beloved estate, Blackwood Manor, nestled deep in the heart of the Dorset countryside. It was a place of warmth and genuine affection, a stark contrast to the cold formality she had once known. Blackwood Manor, though still grand, possessed a welcoming charm. Its gardens less manicured but more wild and beautiful, its rooms filled with books and laughter rather than hushed whispers. Eleanor, now truly the Duchess, embraced her role with a passion and purpose she had never imagined possible. She worked tirelessly alongside Julian, who proved to be not only a loving husband, but also an enlightened and progressive landowner. Together, they initiated several projects to benefit the local community. Eleanor, drawing on her rediscovered love for botany, oversaw the establishment of a large kitchen garden and an apothecary garden, providing fresh produce and herbal remedies for the estate workers and villagers. She also championed the creation of a small schoolhouse where she herself often taught, delighting in sharing her knowledge of literature and natural history with the eager children. Her keen intellect, once stifled, now found endless avenues for expression, and her compassion, once dismissed as weakness, became her greatest strength. Julian was her constant partner, her confidant, and her greatest supporter. Their marriage was a true partnership, built on mutual respect, intellectual camaraderie, and a deep, abiding love. They spent their evenings discussing everything from agricultural innovations to classical philosophy. Their days often spent walking the estate, planning new initiatives, or simply enjoying each other's company. Eleanor had never known such profound happiness, such a sense of belonging. She was not merely a duchess by title, she was a duchess by nature, ruling her small corner of the world with kindness and wisdom. One sunny afternoon, as Eleanor sat sketching a rare wildflower in the gardens of Blackwood Manor, a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves, she paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. Her gaze drifted across the vibrant landscape, the laughter of children from the schoolhouse carrying faintly on the wind, the scent of roses and honeysuckle filling the air. A profound sense of contentment washed over her. She thought back to that dreadful night at Ashworth Hall, the public humiliation, the desperate flight into the darkness. It had been the lowest point of her life, a moment of utter despair. Yet, in that very despair, lay the seeds of her liberation. If the Duchess of Ashworth had not scorned her, if she had not been forced to flee, Eleanor would never have found refuge with Lady Augusta, never discovered her true passions, and never met Julian, the man who saw her for who she truly was. The golden cage, once a symbol of her entrapment, had been shattered, allowing her to truly fly. The pain of the past had forged her into a stronger, more authentic woman, one who understood that true worth came not from titles or societal approval, but from integrity, purpose, and genuine connection. News of the Duchess of Ashworth, Lady Beatrice, occasionally reached Blackwood Manor through distant relatives or London newspapers. Her social standing, though not entirely ruined, had been irrevocably diminished. She remained at Ashworth Hall, a formidable but increasingly isolated figure, her influence waning, her once loyal circle having largely dispersed. Lord Alistair, after a brief, ill-fated marriage to a wealthy but rather dull heiress, had settled into a life of quiet dissipation, forever overshadowed by his elder brother's success and his mother's notoriety. Their lives, Eleanor reflected, seemed to lack the warmth and genuine purpose that filled her own. They were still trapped, in their own ways, by the very conventions and expectations they had sought to uphold. Eleanor closed her sketchbook, a soft smile gracing her lips. She had not merely survived, she had thrived. She had found her voice, her purpose, and her true love, not in the glittering ballrooms of London, but in the quiet strength of her own spirit and the unwavering heart of a man who loved her unconditionally. She had learned that true freedom was not the absence of constraint, but the courage to choose one's own path, to bloom wherever one was planted, and to live a life authentic to oneself. The remote cottage, the symbol of her escape, had led her to a life richer and more fulfilling than any ducal title could ever promise. She was home, truly home, in her own skin, with her beloved Julian, building a future filled with love, purpose, and boundless joy. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you listening from? Let me know.